Everybody that followed my case read that. They didn't read the 2,000-page Dowd report.
But contained within the Dowd report was his gathered evidence, circumstantial, that said you bet on baseball.
I mean, I remember things pretty good. And I'm going to tell you right now, Joe, I do not remember betting on baseball in 1986.
The biggest criminal in baseball history did not look like a criminal. He looked like a hero. Pete Rose looked like everything America wanted to believe about itself. He was tough. He was relentless. He was the man they called Charlie Hustle, and he played the game of baseball with a fury that nobody before or since has ever matched. 4,256 hits. That number belongs to him and him alone. No player in the history of Major League Baseball has ever come close. For millions of fans, Pete Rose was not just a great ball player.
And quick favor right here. If you want more stories like this one, use the hype feature and give hype to this video. It helps a ton. Now, back to the story. He was truly living proof that hard work alone was enough. That if you wanted it badly enough and were willing to outwork every single person around you, you could become the greatest of all time. Kids grew up wearing his number. They ran the bases in sandlots pretending to be him. He was living proof of what hustle could build and what it could become. Because when Pete Rose died at 83, what started coming out was not the story they had been selling you.
A woman now claims she had an ongoing sexual relationship with Rose that started when she was 14 or 15.
The ex-wives spoke. The FBI files surfaced in full. The court documents were already public for anyone who cared to look. Federal prosecutors had put him in a prison camp years before. His gambling debts had reached into organized crime at the highest levels. And when you line all of it up from beginning to end, from the first warning sign all the way to the final years, what you are looking at is a criminal profile that baseball never wanted its fans to see. His ex-wife Carol said in 2018 that he blew most of his money in high-stakes gambling sessions and carried enormous debts to both casinos and the IRS. His first wife Carolyn said she divorced him because of his womanizing and his complete inattention to his family. These are not rumors. These are documented accusations made by women who were inside that life. The image they sold you was real on the baseball field. Everything behind it was something else entirely. So let us go back to the beginning. Let us go back to the single moment that told you exactly who Pete Rose was when the rules got in the way of what he wanted. The year was 1970. The setting was the All-Star Game. Before anything else, you need to understand what the All-Star Game is. It is an exhibition. It does not count in the standings. It does not affect the playoffs or the pennant race or anything that matters competitively. It is a showcase. Players from both leagues come together for one night to entertain the fans, play a few innings, and go home healthy. That is the agreement between every player on that field. Nobody gets hurt in a game that means nothing. You compete, you put on a show, and you walk away. Everyone understands that. It is an unwritten rule so obvious that most players never even have to think about it. Pete Rose did not follow that rule. In the 12th inning, Rose came charging toward home plate. Catcher Ray Fosse was standing in position, waiting for a throw that was already on its way. Rose had time to think. He had options. He could have slid. He could have eased up given the circumstances. He could have done what any reasonable player does in a meaningless exhibition game played deep into the night. Instead, he drove straight through Fosse with full force. He lowered his shoulder and ran through him, the way you would run through someone in a Game 7 of the World Series. The collision was violent. Fosse went down hard. He came away from that play with a fractured and separated shoulder. The injury effectively derailed the young catcher's career. He was never the same player after that night. He became, as the research puts it directly, a tragic footnote to a style of play that bordered on the sociopathic. At the time, many people praised it. Sports writers called it hustle. They said it was just who Charlie Rose was. They framed it as intensity. But sports historians and legal analysts who later examined the full arc of his life looked back at that moment and saw something different. They saw a man who treated the rules of engagement as obstacles rather than boundaries to be respected. They saw someone who believed that what he wanted was more important than the well-being of anyone standing in his path. That is not just aggressive play. It is a way of moving through the world. And as the research points out clearly, that mindset did not stay on the baseball diamond. It followed Pete Rose into every corner of his life for the next 5 decades. Now here is where the story gets dark. By the mid-1980s, Rose was no longer just a player. He was the manager of the Cincinnati Reds. He had the uniform, the lineup card, the clubhouse trust, the contract, and the responsibility that came with all of it. He had transitioned from one of the most beloved players in the sport to a man charged with guiding a franchise. And he was gambling, not casually, not on horse races as a side hobby. He was betting on baseball. Specifically, he was betting on the Cincinnati Reds, the exact team he was paid to manage. Baseball has one rule that sits above all others when it comes to gambling. It is called Rule 21. In plain terms, Rule 21 says that any person who is part of the game is forbidden from placing bets on games in which they have a duty to perform. It does not matter whether you bet for your team or against them. It does not matter how much money you put down. The rule is absolute. It exists because when a manager has money riding on the outcome of a game, every single decision he makes becomes suspect. Every time he decides whether to pull the starting pitcher, every time he sets the lineup, every strategic call in a tight game carries a shadow behind it. Was that a baseball decision made for the good of the team? Or was that a gambling decision made to protect a wager? The fans who paid to watch deserved a manager whose choices were made entirely for the team. Pete Rose did not give them that. In 1989, the Commissioner of Baseball ordered a full investigation. The attorney named to lead it was John M. Dowd. What Dowd and his team put together over 6 months became known as the Dowd Report. And it was not a loose collection of allegations based on rumors. It was a forensic breakdown, detailed and documented, of exactly how Rose had been secretly betting on baseball while publicly acting like everything was fine. The evidence was specific and overwhelming. Handwriting experts examined betting sheets and confirmed that the numerical entries on those sheets matched Pete Rose's handwriting. Those sheets documented the wagers he had placed on his own team. According to the report, Rose bet on the Cincinnati Reds in 52 separate games in 1987 alone. The minimum wager per game was $2,000. Some allegations suggested he was placing as much as $10,000 on a single day. His associates, specifically Paul Jansen and Ronald Peters, gave first-hand testimony to investigators, confirming they had personally placed bets on Rose's behalf. The chain of evidence was clear. The paper trail was real. The betting had been escalating uncontrollably since at least 1985, according to the investigation's findings. The investigation itself was meticulous. Dowd and his team did not rush to a conclusion. They built their case the way a prosecutor builds a case meant to hold up in court. They tracked down associates. They secured testimony. They obtained documents. They brought in experts to examine handwriting samples. They built a timeline that showed this was not a brief lapse in judgment, but a sustained pattern of illegal wagering that had been going on for years before anyone in the league's official structure had moved to stop it. The picture that emerged from all of that work was of a man who had managed a Major League Baseball team while simultaneously running what amounted to a personal gambling operation behind the scenes. And the people he had trusted to help him place those bets were not casual acquaintances. They were associates with serious criminal backgrounds. The gambling had escalated uncontrollably by 1985. That timeline matters. By the time the Dowd Report named him and the ban was handed down in 1989, Rose had been betting on baseball for at least 4 years. 4 years of wagers. 4 years of accumulating debt into criminal networks. 4 years of managing a team while that financial exposure sat underneath every decision he made in a dugout. On August 24th, 1989, Pete Rose accepted a permanent ban from Major League Baseball. He was finished as a manager and finished as any official participant in the sport that had made him famous. But here is what made it so much worse. He did not admit it. For 15 years, he did not admit any of it. Despite the betting sheets confirmed by handwriting experts, despite the testimony of multiple associates, despite the forensic detail of the Dowd Report itself, Pete Rose spent the next 15 years publicly attacking everyone who said he had done it. He went after John Dowd's credibility. He attacked Commissioner A. Bartlett Giamatti. He gave interview after interview in which he denied ever betting on baseball. He denied betting on the Reds. He characterized the entire investigation as a coordinated effort to destroy a man who had dedicated his life to the sport. He positioned himself as the victim, and a portion of the public believed him because he delivered the denial with the same intensity he had delivered everything else in his career. 15 years. That is not a brief period of embarrassment before eventual honesty. That is a sustained, calculated, decade-and-a-half campaign of public deception directed at fans who trusted him and at investigators who had simply told the truth. It ended in 2004. That year, Rose published his autobiography. He called it My Prison Without Bars. And in that book, he finally admitted what the documents had proven 15 years earlier. He had bet on the Reds while managing them. 15 years of calling honest people liars. And then a book deal. The scale of that deception should not be understated. This was not a man who stayed quiet and let the controversy fade. He actively fought back. He gave speeches at events. He signed autographs and posed for photos with fans who believed in him. Because he kept telling them the investigators were wrong. He cultivated public sympathy by positioning himself as a man being persecuted. He allowed people who cared about him to defend him passionately on his behalf. People who were defending a lie without knowing it. Every one of those people had been deceived by a man who simply refused to accept that the evidence against him was real, and that eventually the truth would stand on its own. Now we need to talk about who Pete Rose was actually placing those bets with. Because this is where the story stops being about sports rules and becomes something far more serious. Rose's primary bookmaking contact was a man named Ronald Peters. Peters was not simply a neighborhood guy taking bets on the side. He was connected to a Chicago-based gambling organization run by a man named Dominic Basso. Basso had been formally identified by the Chicago Crime Commission as a crew leader for mob chieftains, including a man named Ernest Rocco Infelice. The organization Basso ran was part of the Chicago Outfit, one of the most powerful organized crime syndicates operating anywhere in the United States. Federal agents who had placed a monitor on Basso's car phone discovered a list of 130 gamblers identified only by code names. Among those coded entries, the records showed totals allegedly exceeding $225,000 that were connected to Pete Rose. But this was not his only connection into that world. When Rose joined the Philadelphia Phillies in 1979, he did not leave his gambling networks behind in Cincinnati. He expanded them. In Philadelphia, he sought out betting lines through mob-linked bookies named Ralph Stano Jr. and Joseph Pungatori, known in those circles by the street nickname Pung. Then, in the mid-1980s, the network expanded again. Rose began working with a man named Richard Troy, who operated under the nickname Big Val. Troy ran his operation out of Staten Island. Federal records linked him directly to not one, but three separate New York crime families: the Bonanno family, the Colombo family, and the Genovese family. By the time the Dowd investigation was underway, Rose's debt to Troy alone had reportedly reached $200,000. Think about what that actually means. The manager of a Major League Baseball team owed $200,000 to a single bookie connected to three of the most dangerous organized crime families in New York. People who carry that level of debt to those kinds of organizations do not simply receive a polite reminder to pay up. They become targets for coercion. They can be pressured into leaking private team information. They can be manipulated into influencing the outcomes of games. The research describes this situation as an existential threat to the integrity of Major League Baseball. A manager inside the financial grip of the mob is not just a personal problem. He is a risk to every honest game, every trusting fan, and every player who steps onto the field expecting competition that is not predetermined. There is something specific about the dynamic of owing large sums to violent criminal organizations that is worth understanding clearly. When an ordinary person falls into serious debt, the consequences are financial. When a person in Rose's position, a manager with access to sensitive team information, falls that deeply into debt with people connected to organized crime, the consequences can extend to the sport itself. Rose's fame, the files implied, had been functioning as a shield between him and the local legal system for years. Now we shift to a different kind of reckoning. While the baseball investigation had been about the integrity of a sport, the Internal Revenue Service had a more straightforward problem. They were tracking money that had been taken and not reported to the government. On April 20th, 1990, Pete Rose stood in a federal courtroom and entered his plea. Not to gambling, not to lying about gambling. He pleaded guilty to 2 felony counts of filing false income tax returns. The prosecution had built its case carefully. They established that between 1984 and 1987, Rose had hidden more than $354,000 in income from the government. That money came from memorabilia sales, card show appearances, autograph signings, and gambling winnings on horse races. He had collected the cash and kept it off the books. He had not made an error on a complicated tax form. He had deliberately and systematically concealed more than $354,000. The sentence came down: 5 months in federal prison, 3 months in a halfway house, a fine of $50,000. back taxes, interest, and penalties totaling $366,043 owed to the IRS. He served his sentence at the federal prison camp in Marion, Illinois. Judge S. Arthur Spiegel made a statement during the proceedings that became part of the record for a reason. The prosecution described that day in court as, in their exact words, a sad day for those young Americans to whom Pete Rose was an idol. Federal prosecutors stood in a courtroom and said out loud that this guilty plea was a sad day for children who had looked up to this man. Because it was. Those kids had run the bases pretending to be him. They had worn his number. They had held him up as proof that hard work and hustle meant something. And he had lied to their government and gone to prison for it. The memorabilia economy that Rose had built around his fame was considerable. He was in demand at card shows and autograph signings across the country. He could command significant fees just to sit at a table and sign his name for a few hours. None of that was illegal. What was illegal was collecting that money in cash and not reporting it. Between 1984 and 1987, across 4 years of appearances and gambling winnings, he had quietly accumulated more than $354,000 that the government did not know existed. He had done this as one of the most famous athletes in the country. He was still collecting a salary from Major League Baseball. He was not a desperate man hiding a few $100s out of necessity. He was a wealthy, famous public figure who chose to hide income because he could and because he needed the cash for his gambling debts. Even after he walked out of that prison camp, the financial destruction did not stop. In 2004, a tax lien of nearly $1 million was filed against him. Another lien followed in 2009, another in 2012. The same patterns that had put him in a federal prison camp continued for years after his release. The gambling, the debt, and the financial chaos had become permanent features of his life. His second wife, Carol, described all of it from the inside in 2018. She said he blew most of their money in high-stakes gambling sessions. She described the weight of what he owed to casinos on top of everything he owed to the IRS. The prison sentence had not reset anything. The addiction had not stopped. The consequences just kept building. Now we reach the part of this story that requires the most care, because what came out in 2016 and 2017 had nothing to do with baseball rules or tax returns. In 2016, Pete Rose made a legal decision that ended up backfiring severely. He filed a defamation lawsuit against John Dowd. Dowd had made public comments about Rose's alleged sexual misconduct involving minors. Rose's plan was to attack Dowd's credibility one final time, to take him to court and win. But that lawsuit opened a door that could not be closed again. When Rose filed that defamation suit, a woman identified in the court documents only as Jane Doe came forward with a sworn declaration. A sworn declaration is a formal legal statement made under penalty of perjury. It carries serious legal weight. Jane Doe stated that she had a sexual relationship with Pete Rose in the 1970s, and that it had begun when she was only 14 or 15 years old. The court documents describe the timeline she provided in detail. She stated that Rose first contacted her by phone in 1973, when she was 14 or 15. She said they met at a house in Cincinnati, and that a sexual relationship began before she had turned 16. She stated the relationship lasted for several years. Rose's own legal team responded in their court filings, and in those filings, his team did not deny that a relationship with this woman had existed. They disputed the timing. Rose claimed the relationship had not started until 1975, and that at that point, he believed the woman was 16 years old. He argued that because the age of consent in Ohio was 16, the relationship had been legal under Ohio law. He also denied in those filings any sexual contact in states like Florida, where the age of consent was higher. The damage to his remaining public standing was severe. He had filed the lawsuit to defend himself and ended up creating a formal legal record that contained his own legal team's acknowledgement of the relationship while disputing only the age and timing. The Philadelphia Phillies had been moving forward with plans for a ceremony to induct Rose into their Wall of Fame. He had been a central part of their 1980 World Championship team. After the court documents became public, the Phillies canceled the ceremony without hesitation. By December 2017, the defamation lawsuit Rose had initiated was dismissed with prejudice. He had gone to court to protect what remained of his reputation and came out the other side of the process in far worse condition than before he filed. Now let us hear from the women who lived inside Pete Rose's personal life. Not prosecutors, not federal investigators, the two women who married him and watched what the public never saw. Rose was married twice. First to Carolyn Engelhart, later to Carol J. Woleung. Both marriages ended in divorce. Both women gave accounts of what life with Pete Rose actually looked like, behind the public image of Charlie Hustle. Carolyn Rose was there for all of it, during the peak years. She stood beside him through the Big Red Machine era, through the championships, through the height of his fame. She divorced him in 1980. When she described why, she used two words together: womanizing and inattention. His inattention to his family. Those were her words to describe the man America was celebrating as a hero. While Rose was the celebrated face of Cincinnati baseball, his wife was dealing with a man who was repeatedly unfaithful and repeatedly absent from the family he had built. In 1979, a paternity suit confirmed that Rose had fathered a child out of wedlock with a woman named Terry Rubio. That was while his marriage to Carolyn was still active. It became part of the legal record, not an allegation, a confirmed fact in the court documents. When Rose's second marriage to Carol later ended in divorce as well, Carolyn made a comment that said everything in 5 words. She said, "What comes around, goes around." That was the response of a woman who had watched the same patterns that destroyed her marriage destroy someone else's. She was not surprised. She had already seen exactly how this story ended. Carol Rose gave her own account in 2018. She described watching Rose blow most of the family's money in what she called high-stakes gambling sessions. She described the debt he had piled up at casinos. She described the ongoing weight of what he owed the IRS. The picture she drew was of a man in permanent financial chaos, always gambling, always in debt, always managing the wreckage of the last bad decision while walking straight toward the next one. These were not abstract financial problems she was describing. She was describing a life, a household, children growing up in that environment. What Carol described in 2018 is worth dwelling on for a moment. She was not speaking as someone who had merely observed Rose's gambling from a distance. She was describing the financial reality of their shared life. She watched money leave the household in gambling sessions. She was aware of what he owed to casinos. She knew about the ongoing debts to the IRS. Living with all of that is not the same as reading about it in a newspaper. It is a daily experience of financial instability in a home where the person responsible for the family's security cannot stop gambling long enough to pay his taxes. She chose to speak about it publicly. That decision matters. It means she wanted people to understand what was happening behind the public image of the hit king. The testimonies of these two women are not a small detail at the edge of this story. They are the human center of it. Their marriages were real. Their losses were real. And everything they described lines up completely with what the federal investigations found and what the court documents confirmed. The addiction did not only take down a baseball career, it took down 2 marriages and destabilized the lives of people who had nothing to do with gambling or bookies or FBI files. The research on compulsive gambling as a condition is relevant here. Pathological gambling is recognized as a disorder in which a person continues to gamble despite increasingly serious negative consequences. The defining feature is not the amount of money lost. It is the inability to stop, even when stopping is clearly the rational choice. Rose had every reason to stop gambling long before the Dowd investigation reached its conclusion. He had his career to protect. He had his reputation to protect. He had his family to protect. None of those things were enough to override the compulsion. He kept betting. He kept accumulating debt. He kept building connections into the underworld to get better access to betting lines. He kept hiding money from the government to fund his next wager. The pattern did not break because the addiction did not break. At this point, it is worth asking the question that sits underneath all of it. Why did this keep happening? How does a man with that level of talent, that level of fame, and that much to lose continue making the same choices over and over for 5 decades? The research points toward pathological gambling addiction as the core explanation, and Pete Rose himself provided one of the most honest lines of his entire life on the subject. In his own written words, he said this: "Compulsive gambling makes you less than honest about your life." That single sentence explains the 15 years of denial. It explains the mob debts. It explains the hidden income and the federal felony plea. It explains 2 marriages ending the same way. When you are driven by a compulsion to gamble, you build your entire daily life around protecting that compulsion. You lie to investigators because the truth is the biggest threat your addiction faces. You hide income so you have more cash to put into the next wager. You attack the credibility of honest people because letting their evidence stand means the addiction loses. Everything you do is in service of keeping the gambling alive. During the legal proceedings, attorneys for John Dowd formally requested Pete Rose's mental health records, Specifically, they sought records related to ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, and pathological gambling. Oppositional defiant disorder, in simple terms, is a condition involving a persistent pattern of hostility and defiance toward rules and authority figures. Rose's legal team fought hard to block those requests. But the fact that the courts were attempting to access mental health records at all reflects something important. Even the legal system recognized that his behavior went beyond ordinary dishonesty. The research describes him as a man whose neurological wiring may have made him a perfect hitter, but a disastrous manager and citizen. The same obsessive drive that built a record no one has broken may have been the exact force that made him incapable of stopping, no matter what it cost him. Now, let us put it all together, because when you look at the full arc of Pete Rose's life, without the mythology in the way, what you see is not a collection of separate bad decisions scattered across decades. You see one continuous pattern running without interruption from 1970 to the end. It started with Ray Fosse, a meaningless exhibition game, a young catcher who never fully recovered from an injury he had no reason to sustain. A moment that revealed clearly how Pete Rose responded when the rules stood between him and the outcome he wanted. Then came the gambling, betting on his own team while managing them,
building connections that ran through the Chicago outfit, through New York crime families, through a Staten Island bookie to whom he owed $200,000, entering bars through private doors, being surrounded by people moving briefcases handcuffed to their wrists. FBI documents describing fears that local corruption was shielding him from prosecution. Then, 15 years of publicly labeling honest investigators as liars. Then, a federal courtroom where he entered a guilty plea and walked into a prison camp. Then, more tax liens in the years after his release. Then, a defamation lawsuit he filed himself that produced legal filings his own team submitted containing admissions he could not walk back. Then his first wife saying, "What comes around, goes around." Then his second wife describing the gambling sessions and the debt that went on year after year. The research calls this a catastrophic moral and legal collapse. That framing is accurate. And here is what makes the story genuinely tragic. The baseline was extraordinary. His 4,256 hits are real. Nobody else has matched that number. The talent was not manufactured. The obsession he brought to every plate appearance was genuine. The work ethic that earned him the name Charlie Hustle was real. He was one of the greatest pure hitters the sport has ever seen. That part of the story is true and always will be. But great talent on a baseball field does not cancel out what happened away from it. Rules exist for reasons. Rule 21 exists because a manager who places bets on his own team turns every game decision into something fans cannot fully trust. Tax laws exist because every person who benefits from the systems that society builds owes a contribution to maintaining them. Rose collected cash from card shows and memorabilia appearances and hid it while everyone else paid their share. And the women who gave their testimony are not footnotes. They were inside that life. His first wife described years of womanizing and absence. His second wife described watching their money disappear into gambling sessions.
These are human costs connected to the same choices that cost him his career and eventually put him in a federal prison camp. There is a version of this story where Pete Rose is simply a flawed man who loved baseball and got consumed by a separate addiction that had nothing to do with his talent. That version is not entirely false. Addiction is real. The damage it does to people who carry it is real. The research acknowledges that the psychological forces driving his behavior were deeply embedded and may have had roots in conditions he carried his entire life. None of that is invented or sensationalized. It is part of the documented record. But acknowledging an addiction does not erase what that addiction drove a person to do. Rose did not just gamble quietly and lose money. He gambled on his own team. He built connections to violent criminal organizations. He lied about it for 15 years in public while calling honest people liars. He hid income from the federal government and went to prison for it. And the women who loved him watched it destroy their households. The addiction explains the pattern. It does not excuse the choices that pattern produced. You can respect what Pete Rose did on a baseball field. You can hold the 4,256 hits as a genuine achievement and acknowledge that the fans who loved Charlie Hustle were not wrong to admire the work they saw. That is a fair thing to say. But you cannot look away from the rest of it. The mob connections, the FBI files, the federal felony guilty plea, the sworn court declarations, and the testimony of the women who knew him from the inside are all part of the same life and the same record.
The research names it clearly: a systematic betrayal of the integrity of the game and the trust of millions of fans who believed in him. Charlie Hustle was real. The Hit King title was earned in full. But the man behind that title made choices across 5 decades that caused real harm to real people, broke federal laws, and built a private life on deception. And in the end, it was not the pitchers who faced him across all those at-bats who brought him down. It was the crimes he could never stop committing. These rules exist for a reason. Integrity matters in sports and outside of it. And the lesson that runs through every chapter of this story, for every athlete and every young person who has ever looked up to someone, is that no number in the record books can substitute for the choices a person makes when the lights go dark. If this story made you think, drop a comment below and tell us your take on the Pete Rose Hall of Fame question. Like the video if it hit different for you, and subscribe because we put serious research into every single story we tell.